something that kept in my mind, the theme was like, where is the church, or where is God's people? Words that started sticking out were Sabbath and synagogue. I recently heard something Bishop Barron said. The Sabbath day of rest is a time for praise of God. And so if it's praising God, then the synagogue or church location is where the people come together as a church to praise God. So then when I saw the verse where it says, on the following Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. Like for me, that stuck out. I was like, okay, so there was a church. Actually, previous to that, it actually was on the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue. Many Jews and worshippers who were converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who spoke to them and urged them to remain faithful to the grace of God. So in a way, I'm kind of linking that to praising God. On the Sabbath, praising God, people are coming together, so there's a church. But then thrown in there, underlying there is the labels, Jews, Gentiles. From what I took from it, I'm seeing one group was like, we're the church. But when I'm reading overall, I'm like, no, the church is where the people are praising God as a community. And so it was kind of building up, building up, building up. And at the end of it, at the end of this reading, it fell apart because of like division. And so the church was just, again, Paul and Barnabas going somewhere else, trying to come together as a community with other people to, again, trying to gather everyone as a church. See if that can happen in Iconium.
You know, I love to look up the Hebrew etymology, or in the case of Acts, the Greek etymology for the words that are used. And I was reading an unpacking of the Hebrew word for grace as I looked at this. The reason being, in that verse 14, Paul and Barnabas spoke to them and urged them to remain faithful to the grace of God. The grace. I was struck by the phrasing, not remain faithful to God, but remain faithful to the grace of God. So in early Hebrew pictographs, that word grace, which like most other words that are tried to be explained from one language of origin to another, it limps, I think, a little. Originally, the word referred to the encampment of the Israelites while they were in the desert for 40 years, which wasn't just an array of tents all over the place, but almost like a circle the wagon kind of thing. There was a definite shape made to the tents as they were encamped in the desert, almost like a barricade in the sense of protection. Okay, so now if you take that, and the second part of the pictogram is a seed with a tendril, the idea being that it's something that continues. Okay, so to try to put this into English misses the point with just that, albeit beautiful word grace, I think, because there's all these nuances or valences to it that we can miss, I think, that will play right into what you're saying. There's the idea of strength and protection and nurturing something, protection, not necessarily protection from the enemies, but holding something precious. The idea of precious even comes in there. And of course, the idea of being saved or delivered in a way that goes on. Now that's going to piggyback on something that I heard or received when I looked over these two readings. Of course, Sabbath was ordained, right, for the Israelite people as a way to stop everything to remember, in fact, the grace of God. It was, and that the proper response of that was praise. I've often thought that so much of modern life has missed the whole idea of worshiping on Sunday, because the whole point is to give God praise, not because I am looking to get an answer for myself or to get something out of it outside of that context. The purpose of coming together is glorifying God, worshiping God, praising God. It's really completely God-centered. That's why originally there would be no work allowed on the Sabbath, because everything was supposed to be attentive, like you're supposed to be kind of poised and just conscious of, aware of the goodness of God, the mercy of God, the love of God in your whole life. You stopped everything so that you wouldn't be distracted, and just that was your whole day. That defined it. So that is the idea of Sabbath. And of course, you're mentioning the growth. This is why I'm piggybacking on the Hebrew etymology of grace. So in the beginning of that reading of Acts, there's a gathering in the synagogue, and Paul and Barnabas were there as part of that group, right? As part of the group of the Jewish men. And then on the next paragraph, where we jump to the body of the reading, verses 43 to 52, then the whole city is gathered. And so you're presuming outside, right? And you're saying, well, then that's church. Okay, look at the connecting word between those. It's exactly the one I pointed out to. They urge them to remain faithful to the grace of God. So the idea of grace and this dynamism, this movement that really is embedded in what the idea of grace is kind of showing in a subtle way. It's showing the growth of, I'll say, church from Sabbath past that, because was that not even the original idea of chosen people? Through this group of people and how they live, God will enter through that group of chosen people to the world. This is that in a microcosm. So in the beginning, it happens in a synagogue, and then it's going to break open, right, into, you're presuming, a large place outside where the whole city can gather to do that. So the link word that I connect to is the Hebrew nuanced, valenced meaning of that word grace, which is, for me, the connecting word, the idea being growth, and that it must continue, must continue, must continue. And then when you said the idea collapsed at the end, it collapsed because it was going to be kept from continuing to move. Because in all of Scripture, that's the dynamic of God, right? I've often said this, the trajectory of God is moving forward, and an ingathering and a fullness. That's always been the trajectory of God in history. And so when that didn't happen at the end of the reading of Acts, then they're going to shake the dust from their feet and keep going, because you can't stop the movement if you're remaining faithful to the grace of God, which, as I said, in the original Hebrew pictogram had this little line which indicated a seed and its tendril. Things were going to grow, things were going to keep moving, things were going to move ahead, and Paul and Barnabas were at the service of that.
Wouldn't, from that line that you highlighted, urge them to remain faithful to the growth and movement of God? It was kind of a plea to say, come follow us as we continue this. And the people didn't. So in the beginning, it was like, we're telling you, please, 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 don't be set in your ways and follow something that is building up. And at the end of it, it was just them two.
Well, at least in this pericope, that's the point is, right? I think the point is not to talk about if anybody did. I think the point is the movement and the growth. And you made a really important point, I think, because when you conflated be faithful and follow, I think that's a really important connection, because there's this tendency in all of us, when we think we have something good, or the corner on the market of truth or something like that, that we tend to this inertia of not moving, right? So that an object at rest stays at rest, right? Isn't that the principle of physics? So we tend to that, and then all of the attention is is centripetal. It focuses in, I think, when that's not what we're being invited to. So sometimes when we think of faithful, I picture that a lot of us think of it in a hold on tightly to something way, when in fact, you're using the word follow. When you read that, you first read faithful and then follow. That's exactly it. I think we cannot keep this intellectually. So if the first people, before they were called Christians, were called followers of the way, it indicated movement. And that's how you remained faithful, because what you were remaining faithful to was not an intellectual idea. It wasn't an ideology. It was a person with whom you related and responded to. I think that's another huge thing, responding to this. It's all the realization of the connection of the divine in us is only the beginning, and we can't keep it there. We have to respond. In fact, the other thing, when I read the gospel after reading the first reading, I was thinking, well, the Acts talked about feet, shaking the dust from your feet, and John talked about hands, right? Hands and feet. It's very incarnate if you just take those two themes. And piggybacking on your idea of following, that's how you do it. You do it in a physical way, right? You do it, in other words, you get up and change your life. You do something about it, something that will be in gathering. In other words, you'll be acting with the life of God, which you have. If you receive it as a gift, that's the Sabbath part. Stop, pay attention, understand, be open, embrace it, but then you never lock it down. You always keep moving forward with it. I believe so this is about following means using your hands and feet, I think.
The other layer that came to my mind is the whole parable of the seeds fall on certain places, certain soils, certain rocks. Now thinking back to this section of Acts, the people first heard Paul and Barnabas, and they were receptive. It said that they came, they spoke, and people invited them back to come back the following Sabbath. And the following Sabbath, then more people showed up. So it's kind of like that parable in the sense that there are some people who can take it in at first. They do kind of agree with what they're hearing. But then the last step is the blossoming part. And that involves walking, following. That's the kind of the last step. And if that doesn't happen, then that's where, it's the seed fell on kind of like rocky soil amongst like thorny bushes, get choked up. This group of people were going along. It's not like that first they rejected what they were saying. They were like, oh, we like Paul and Barnabas, we're going to start gathering more. But the last step of moving out of what they were, the little stem that they were, into a blossoming further, that's where in this scenario, it didn't happen.
Yep, exactly. I think, and that's always, there's going to have to be something you work past in order to do that, right? Because your natural inclination is to see something as good and just want to either sit down and keep it, or sit down and enjoy it, or preserve it, and this whole Paschal mystery part of who we are, right? That we have to keep losing the parts of ourselves that block this trajectory so that the rising can keep going. That's just so hard. And it's so part of everything, of all of life. I think it's so much part of all of life. It defines us, but we resist it. We want to either quantify or qualify both our following, what it means, how much it will mean. And that's just not God. Somehow I think Teresa of Avila said, you can't know the goodness, love, and mercy of God without knowing, this isn't her word, like your miserableness first. but I think there's this initial point in the journey where you are intensely aware and reflective of this truth of the divine in you. And then if you keep paying attention to it and not want to keep it boxed up, it leads naturally into following, which is harder. So we become, as soon as we start focusing on that, I think we realize things about ourselves that stop the journeying, the walking, which isn't a bad thing, because realizing it sometimes helps you to acknowledge it and let it go so you can keep on walking. Because what's the important thing in that parable you mentioned? The walking, right? You keep moving. That's the dynamism of God.
Well, in the gospel, it says that, it says, my sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me. As the shepherd is leading the sheep, they're meant to move with the shepherd. Again, not stationary, but a movement with the grace of God, which then is, again, if you layer down top of the facts, the grace of God was working through Paul and Barnabas, and they were moving, but were they fully recognizing the voice of God in them to go with them?
And why do the sheep move? Because they recognize the voice of the shepherd. And that's been proven, right? Over and over again through the years. The sheep really do recognize the voice of their shepherd and therefore move. So they're not isolated somewhere on a hillside without food and water and in the elements and unprotected and die. The movement is critical, isn't it? So, but it comes out of the recognition of the connection to the shepherd. And so the first thing is recognition of this truth. And then if you just don't run away from that, you recognize things about yourself and ask for the help that you might keep moving forward. More and more growth, more deeper, to go deeper. And it will become more clear and more deep if you are faithful, if you keep following, if you keep not being afraid to name all these blocks in you, the wrong parts, the parts that are wrong, evil, resistant, unkind, you could go on and on and on with those things. But if you can count so much, lean into so much the relationship that you can face it and then walk right past it into the future. In the 1970s, there was this piece of art that was really popular in convents anyway. It was really popular. It was this giant, I always thought it was a little bit weird, but there was this giant hand, like from here up, this person kind of leaning into the hand, but the hand was giant, hand of God, right? And it just was so disembodied that it kind of made me not feel comfortable. But at any rate, and the point was, the Isaiah's quote, I've carved you, I know you by name, I've carved you in the palm of my hand. The idea being the comfort of being so known and loved by God. And so as I get older, that I actually thought of that when I read this, no one can take them out of my hand. That image was right there. And it actually connected to what I see in these two readings as the invitation to move into the future, into a bigger, more inclusive, more just, more loving, more good, more full of light future. And because we can get stuck in our need for the comfort. And that's, this intellectualizing can also be an emotional thing. There can be an emotional component to that you just look for the comfort so much that you're losing the following. And I think we can't do that, because I don't think it exists separate from it. It comes first, I think. Always the initiative is God's and ours is the response. And to me, the comfort is that God is the initiator, and then the conversation keeps going.